Hi, and welcome back to Map the Maze. So this week, it's the last life skill, who can believe it, from Stress Free for Good. This skill, we have definitely been flexing some skill building muscles to get to this point. Let me put it that way. This skill is tough. This skill is accept what you cannot change. So in a mediation context, I often see people wrestling with this concept that there are things where we need strength, and maybe there are things where you need good advice. But then at the end of the day, there are things that you just have to accept. Some of the most poignant ones that I see when I'm working with people can just be around, do we want to end this relationship? And it sounds strange because most of my work, the vast majority of my work, is about working with people who have made the decision to separate. And when I say people, it can just be one of the people. That at least in Hong Kong, in this jurisdiction, you can't stop somebody from being able to file for divorce, to apply for divorce. You can contest it, although I have had clients who've done that, who've contested the divorce, mostly because they don't accept the reasons for the divorce. Although I would say, if somebody wants to get divorced, why would you want to stay in relationship with them? I think is a really important question. But definitely there are people who I speak to, particularly at intake, who say, we haven't tried hard enough, we didn't work hard enough. I want to give this another go. I'm willing to make compromises. I'm willing to respond maybe to the concerns that the other person has raised over time. Maybe before I wasn't ready. Now I'm ready. The overwhelming majority of the time, it's too late. That mostly when I work with people, the moment when change could have happened for everyone and made the difference has passed. And that can be really difficult to accept. I've had a handful of cases where we had this conversation at the intake. So I spoke with somebody and they said, look, I want to see if we can reconcile. We've put it on the agenda. And through conversation, those parties have decided to try and reconcile, but it's very rare. And so often what happens when reconciliation goes on the agenda, and it's always the first thing we talk about if it's on the agenda, is that there's a really difficult and heart-rending conversation that happens, which, generally is one person saying, I want to try and reconcile, and the other person saying, it's too late. So that's tough. It's tough for people, obviously, to have that conversation. It's difficult to sit there and listen to the end. And for some people, the end of their dreams about what can happen. It's really difficult for people to accept it. I think on some level, some of the clients I've worked with have known this is what's going to happen, that there isn't any chance left, but they feel like they've got to try one last time. And for some people, it comes as a massive shock that it really is too late, that actually there is no space or time left that the other person is willing to give to try and reconcile. So accepting what you cannot change is something that I see. It's not on a daily basis, but it's definitely part of my practice, is seeing people having to accept this reality in their lives. And it can be incredibly difficult to see people try and extend the olive branch and for the other person to say, it's just too late for me. So for divorce and separation, I think this is a really important skill. The other thing that I see that I think this is really relevant for is people will try and still maintain control. And I'm not necessarily saying that in a negative way, but control over particularly how the other person parents, how the other person interacts with the children, how they interact with them. They may want more or less contact with the other parent. And that again is also difficult to accept, that even though you will always be co-parents, always, that until you're not around anymore, those children, even if they're in their 80s, will still be your children. That sometimes you just have to accept that the other person isn't going to parent the way you want them to, or prioritize things the way you want them to, or even communicate with you in the way that you want them to. And yet you are still going to have to find a way to co-parent together. So that can be a real challenge. I think this skill is really important and really, really hard. So how do they suggest you do it? Okay, so first thing is if you are feeling controlled by the circumstances, something is totally out of your control. Again, 2 deep belly breaths. It's almost a mantra by this stage. You need to remind yourself that the way to solve problems is not with despair and anger, but with serenity and wisdom. And you need to say, if I can't change the situation, what can I do to make peace with it? What can I do to feel resolved around this situation? And I think that's really what we try and do in the mediation process, is that for two people who have decided they don't want to be in an intimate adult relationship anymore, but maybe who do have children, how do they find a way, excuse me, how do they find a way to co-parent when the underlying basis for the relationship, for having the children in the first place, is gone? And it can be really difficult. Some people are very aligned on their children and arrangements and values, and other people really aren't. And that actually possibly some of those mismatches in people's values and assumptions around children's upbringing and priorities for children are maybe why the relationship has in part broken down, that actually they didn't realize until children appeared that maybe they really had very different views about how children should be raised. So the challenge is, again, I'm just going to say the question again. If I can't change the situation, what can I do to make peace with it? So that is things that we will do. We do talk about in mediation. And that can be things like, okay, so we're not going to be married together. We're not going to be in an adult relationship, but we are still going to co-parent. If we are going to co-parent, what do we agree around schedule for the children? What do we agree around how we're going to spend school holidays? What do we agree around common rules like bedtimes, if we can? What do we agree around how we're going to communicate with each other? All of those things can be discussed in mediation. I would say that generally it requires everyone to agree. So, particularly if you're looking at co-parental guidelines, so maybe things around behavior or how new partners will interact with children or communication. If people don't agree, they don't agree. And so that is a case of how can I accept? But there are definitely things that people can work towards, which actually make everybody feel more comfortable, feel more focused on what is actually important, i.e., their children. If you don't have children, then I think it's also accepting maybe what is the level of contact when you separate. So definitely there are some very tough mediations that I work on where people don't have children who are separating, and maybe after a very long relationship, maybe a very intense relationship, one person might want to have continuing contact, and the other person might say, look, for me, it's over. Once we divorce, that's it. I don't want to have any contact. That's really tough. It's really difficult to say, and it's really difficult to hear. So being able to accept that and find a way to move on and find peace around it, it can be really challenging. I think this is a great life skill for mediation. And again, I'm just going to say that thing again because I think it's really helpful. If I can't change the situation, what can I do to make peace with it? That might be something that the other person will agree to, or it might be something that you do that changes how you interact with them or with the situation. So I'm going to strongly recommend giving that one a go, tough as it is. It's very similar to the Serenity Prayer, which you may be familiar with, which is, I'm just going to read it. Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. If we could only all do that, I think everybody's lives would be easier. But yes, we need to have serenity sometimes, that we can manifest to the universe and power skill. But at the end of the day, there are some things that we cannot change and that we need to find a way to accept them, to feel resolved around them, and to be able to move forward. Some of that can come from Luskin's other book, which is Forgive for Good. So I'd also really recommend that if this is something that you think, I'm really struggling with this, because I think he also has some more nuanced steps in terms of how to be able to move on from something that you find really, really difficult to accept. So, tough life skill, sorry to end with, but things to think about. Yeah. Next week, I'll kind of do a recap because it's a lot of things that we covered, but hopefully some of this has been helpful. I would strongly recommend getting the book. I think it's a great book, and Forgive for Good is the other one that I think is really helpful in this space. So give it a go, and I'll see you next time. Take care.